Welcome to Catalyst, a program about people, ideas, issues, and conversations around them.
Welcome to Catalyst. I'm Doug Webster, your host of the STEM education series, A Renewed Culture of Innovation. STEM stands for Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics. This series was developed to discuss key issues around strengthening our STEM education capacity, leading up to a STEM conference being held at the Burlington Hilton May 24 and 25. The STEM conference is sponsored by the Vermont Department of Education, the National Science Foundation Centers of Excellence, and the National Association for Workforce Improvement. Today's episode is Manufacturing, Element to a Vibrant Economy. My guest is Curt Ventriss, Professor of Public Policy, University of Vermont, and Adjunct Professor of Policy Studies, Johns Hopkins University. Professor Ventriss has published over 100 articles and has co-authored 2 books. He was previously a visiting professor at Oxford University, University of Southern California, and Johns Hopkins. His policy research has focused on economic development, citizen involvement in policy process, policy analysis, policy implementation, and policy ethics. Welcome to the show, Curt.
Thank you.
Curt, we've all heard 20 years ago that manufacturing was being taken care of by other countries. It was a time for the information age and the service economy. Is that a good thing?
Well, let's face it, during this Great Recession, manufacturing took a big hit. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But particularly when you let's look at the state of Vermont, which is critical for our purposes. It's still the second largest employer within the state. I mean, just last year, it produced over $2.2 billion in goods, right behind services as an employment base. How many people does it employ within the state of Vermont? 10.5% of the employment base, compared nationwide 9.1%. So within the state of Vermont, it's still very critical, but a lot of people look at it and they said, look at the decline that we've seen in manufacturing. Mm-hmm. And it's true, if you go back about 12 years, back to 1997, I'm talking about the state of Vermont, we employed about 44,000 people. Mm-hmm. Today, the figures I could get just from last year, it's 31,000. Now it's true, I mean, that's a 25% decline over a 25-year period. But that's only a flip side. You've got to look at the flip side of this argument about when you talk about manufacturing. In fact, what Vermont workers are doing are actually producing 2.5 more times goods than they did in 1997. So what does that mean? That means we're actually getting higher productivity. What's happening, in other words, is that we're employing fewer but more highly trained technical workers. They're actually putting out more goods. One of the myths, there was an important book that came out many years ago, and it generated an enormous amount of debate. And it had a very simple title to it. It was by John Seisman and Michael Cohen, respectively out of Berkeley. And they said, let's look at manufacturing. Everybody says it's on the decline, it's no longer important. But you could tell by the title, Manufacturing Matters, that they said, there's something else going on here that we need to keep our eye on. And one of the things that they came up is that you cannot separate the service economy from the manufacturing economy. They need one another. In fact, just to go to the service economy and negating your manufacturing is counterproductive. And they raise a critical issue in public policy, is that we really need both. Yes, things are changing in manufacturing. Yes, we are demanding more and more technology-intensive manufacturing that requires a really highly skilled workforce that perhaps we didn't need or could have 20 or 25 years ago. But we got to be very careful. I hear policymakers say, let's forget about manufacturing. It's not important. Let's not invest in it. The future is in the service economy. But we have to be very careful about what we mean by service economy. Economists say we have to split it up into two different domains. The first domain we call retail, and the other one we call finance. This retail side is obviously, J.C. Penney, McDonald's. These are jobs usually have lower educational levels associated with them as far as employment, low skilled relatively. They tend to be lower pay, higher turnover rate, versus what we call the finance side, which are insurance, it could be law firms, other financial aspects of the economy. They tend to be, conversely, people with higher educational rates. You have to be highly skilled in certain things, less turnover rate. When you look at these two things, when you talk about where's the jobs occurring, a lot of people argue that when you look at the jobs, they're occurring more and more in the retail side of the equation, which raises some serious questions about, what we need to do is obviously emphasize that part where there's going to be long-term, vibrant job opportunities for people who come out. And one of the biggest concerns that I think we have, whether it be talking about manufacturing or whether it be talking about servicing, is the issue of underemployment. You don't hear a lot about it, but it's becoming more and more on the radar of policymakers. People who are getting a bachelor's degree, but getting a job way below their educational level. Bank teller, for example, do they really need to have a bachelor's degree? And will they be satisfied after going 4 years of college to go and get a job? And that's why a lot of people are looking, maybe what we need to do is have people well-trained in science and engineering and in aspects of what we call the financial part of the service to have those job opportunities in order to have the vibrant economy we want in the future.
Now, what about the distribution of income within those other sectors compared to manufacturing, or what manufacturing was?
There was a research done by Bennett Harrison and Barry Boonstone. I have to tell you, some of the data has been disputed, but they raised a very serious. They looked at people who came and who were laid off, particularly from manufacturing, and they looked at them and what happened to them a couple of years as they re-entered the workforce. And they found on average that they made 40% less money than they did previously from their other job. A lot of that because a lot of them didn't have the commensurate educational level to go into a more higher paying job. And they were forced to go, into retail. So it creates a real challenge how we prepare an educated workforce for the kind of different economy that we're in. We're not in an economy anymore that has little forward investment. We have an economy now that's a global economy. We're competing against different countries worldwide. And hence we have to meet those challenges in a different way. And the better we can educate our workforce and these new skills that they have to have, the better off we're going to be.
Now, new skills in manufacturing or new skills in other sectors. I guess my point is, if we're in retail, the level of pay, what difference would that make if someone had a...
Robert Rice called those dead-end jobs. Those are the jobs that get quick turnover. They tend to be seasonal. They tend to have no pension behind them. Where do people end up? Those aren't the kind of job growth you want to see. Now, it's interesting. I have not deciphered, our employment rate has been going down steadily. I haven't looked at the latest data because I think we're down now to 8.2%. I'm not quite sure. But even putting that aside, and by the way, that's an understated figure because it doesn't count people who haven't quit looking for a job for a while, people underemployed. A lot of people say it's really closer to 15%. But nevertheless, it really raises the issue. So are we creating jobs in a sector that is primarily dead end? And hence not preparing us for kind of a more, we need to produce goods. I mean, manufacturing, going back to Seisman and Michael, still matters because it is integrally linked to the vibrance of a service economy, particularly a service economy that we want to produce the kind of jobs for the future that are higher paying and have higher educational rates associated with them.
Now, I remember when we met 20 years ago, you told me to read
I had brown hair there.
Right, you did. And I remember one of the facts in that book was manufacturing, for every manufacturing job, you're creating 2 to 3 service sector jobs.
Yeah.
So
There is, I forgot the exact ratio they had, but they said it's so interdependent. It really feeds upon one another.
Right.
The point that they were trying to expose is that policymakers, not all of them, I'm not, but a lot of policymakers say, you know, manufacturing is so declining. It's becoming so insignificant now. Why should we invest any more in these things? And they were one of the very first, not the only, to say that is, in fact, a short-sighted strategy to employ. And that what you need to do is look on both sides of the equation to prepare ourselves for a workforce that, you know, a lot of our manufacturing will now be more technology intensive, which will require people who know science and math and engineering. And hence, I mean, the person that goes into manufacturing now who barely got out of high school are days that have long gone. And hence, you know, I mean, we're going to be talking about STEM. We need to prepare those kind of skills for a new kind of manufacturing world that's going to add commensurate to the kind of economic wealth that we want to sustain and keep within the country.
Now, do you think our policymakers, both here in Vermont and in Washington, see that as a, as a priority? And versus maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you couldn't convince anybody to support a manufacturing related or...
You know, in my study, I looked at 19 other states. And I did a lot of interviewing of looking at what was driving their decision making, particularly as they were trying to recruit new industry, manufacturing or otherwise, into their state. And it was interesting to me, you know, they saw, you know, manufacturing, you know, it's something, but, you know, if we can get a Japanese plant in here, that's great, you know. But, you know, it was interesting. They were looking more on the equation of tax incentives, you know, as a way to kind of create. You know, manufacturing and other strategies sort of got short. We lost sight of what was really critical. I mean, we know 2 things empirically that would fill the studio twice over with studies that will generate economic development. And what are they? Number 1 is human capital. We know if you make an investment in a highly trained, highly educated workforce, it will have enormous impact on economic development. We know, conversely, empirically, that if you make an enormous amount of investment in infrastructure, that will have an enormous impact on economic development. What do I mean by economic development? Investment, of course, in bridge and roads, but also things like telecommunication systems. Energy distribution system, waste and water systems. We know those 2 things together add to economic development. It will generate those kind of things. But look at what we're doing in infrastructure. Are we putting the kind of monies into human capital? Are we putting the kind of money into infrastructure? Things that we know empirically that will really generate economic development. You know, we need to kind of remind the policymakers of those things that will have the most substantive impact with the kind of public monies that we perhaps want to invest in. You know, I'll mention Vermont. I mean, Vermont needs to maybe think about where they need to think about what their priorities are about as they think about the future. I just read a study, New England Policy Institute, and they said the following. They said, you know, we're looking at the labor force in New England, and they say we see it only increasing by 2.2% from the year 2009, which was 2 years ago, to 2019. This issue will actually become more acute for states like Vermont and Maine. In other words, they were raising the issue as, this is a serious, we may not have the educated workforce for the kind of jobs that might be coming in. So where are we going to get them? We have to go outside the state, and of course we've got to convince them to come in. But let's face it, are a lot of young people wanting to stay in the state of Vermont? One of the things we're concerned is that they're leaving. Hey, the job opportunities are elsewhere, whether it be in manufacturing or service. You're losing a potential brain drain. And, do we have a policy that really addresses that? We tried to come up with that a couple years ago. I think Dan Fogel tried to come up with how we can kind of keep those people here. But, that's a startling figure, that's not much. I mean, that tells us that we're going to face a major crisis down the road, 5 to 10 years. Are we prepared for that kind of issue?
And when it comes to STEM education, which is the theme of this series, what is the importance and what are the challenges?
Well, I'd say one of the things, as in preparation for this thing, we always hear these figures and they scare us once we hear them. But I have to tell you, I was going through and I had one of my graduate students dig up some recent data. And and the audience will hear this, and they probably have heard this before, but it has enormous implications that goes to the heart of your question. And it's this. It's interesting. Only 17%, I'm talking nationally now here, not just in Vermont, of seniors that graduated from high schools in the U.S. Were actually proficient in math. This is as last year. Only 36% are proficient in basic reading. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand that this may have enormous implications. And also we're getting a disparity between, particularly on knowledge of science and math, particularly cut along racial and minority lines. And particularly, people who have looked at this issue, by the year 2042, the majority of the people in the United States are going to be what we call minorities. They're going to be people other than the Anglo-white population that we have grown accustomed to. The issue is this: are we preparing the kind of students, both in science and math and so forth, for the kind of jobs that will make them competitive internationally? And that's my big concern, and I know it's a concern. Now, what are the challenges to that? And this is what I kind of looked at, and I think this is a vexing challenge that we have. From a policy perspective, we're not looking far enough out. When we do policy, we looked out 2 or 3 years out the road. Now, we do that for reasons that are quite understandable. Most people are elected. Our officials are elected every 4 years.
Right.
Here in Vermont, it's every 2 years. So they, for them to say, hey, will you look out 5 to 10 years? For them, a lot of them say, that's an issue. Yeah, that will be important in the year 2020, but I'm worried about 2012. But there's a cost of inaction here. This is what I worry about, is that this will creep up on us as we kind of neglect this issue. If these trends continue to develop, they will become more and more of a problem for us, and we'll be ill-prepared. I think is, how do we link? I think the challenge for us is not only that we need to bring this to the attention of the general public. If I went down the street, I'll bet you anything, and I asked the citizen, gee, what do you think about how we're preparing our students in science, math, technology, and engineering? Is that a pressing issue or not? You would probably get a reaction, well, I think it's probably important for them to kind of get some basic knowledge, yes. They wouldn't understand how important it is to prepare ourselves 5 to 10 years down the road for this, and how we have to start now versus in the year 2020, where we'll find out that the costs of preparing may be too late, and we'll lose a competitive edge vis-a-vis maybe other countries.
Speaking of competitive edge, what about China?
I knew you were. China, it's interesting. China right now, the big criticism against China, China is becoming in the last, let's face it, 15 years and going back further, it's become a major economic power. I don't have to tell the audience that. I mean, you know, a lot of people argue, you know, what do? They undervalue their currency in order to keep their exports cheap. They compete against our goods. A lot of people argue it puts our own goods in a disadvantage. Of course, our dollar's weak right now, and of course it makes our exports more competitive overseas.
Yeah.
Let's face it, they have been growing. I think right now they're projected to grow, get this, 8.8% just this year, which is a lot, but it's actually slowed down a little bit. Of course, what they're worried about is inflation. They've been increasing their interest rates in order for them kind of curb the inflationary tendency. The big issue with China right now is how do we make their currency actually much more competitive? In other words, get the policymakers to not to undervalue it, so they can make their exports obviously more competitive with our own here.
What about in terms of their own policy on things like manufacturing and producing goods and services? Compared to the way we do it here in the United States?
Okay, you know, that's a hard, let me answer this kind of in reference to the 2 points that I talked about, infrastructure and human capital, which is what we know about economic development. It's interesting, if you look at the data for infrastructural investments, the United States, in terms of quality, rates 23rd of the world. They're sandwiched in between Spain and Chile. We only devoted, as of last year, 2.4% of our GNP to infrastructure investments. You know what China invested? 9%. The EU, even I'm using the EU as an aggregate here, I'm not breaking up into the different countries that are part of the EU, did double that, 5%. I mean, we're way behind. Yet, in other words, China understands what you need to do in order to build the kind of things you need for manufacturing, the things you got to do to be competitive in services. Of course, they see infrastructural investment is key to that. Human capital is interesting. Let me kind of go to that. Of course, they want to educate a workforce. What are they doing? They're sending a lot of their best students over to the United States universities here. You know, they're flooding over, particularly our engineering schools and so forth. But they recognize that human capital is a very critical factor here. And they're trying to, they invest a lot more money, but the actual data I do not have on that particular factor.
Okay, so what do we do as far as STEM education here in the United States, here in Vermont?
Okay, I've given this some thought.
30 seconds.
Yeah, 30 seconds. I think there's three things we need to do. I mean, besides the obvious of bringing it to the public consciousness of why this is important, how it's important to economic development. We have to put a focus on how we can provide students with what we call content knowledge, so they know the importance of these disciplines, how we have to link it into an interdisciplinary theme. You know, these relate to other things too, the quality of life that we want to have, our cultural life that we want to experience within our respective communities, and the essential skills that we have to build upon in order to make these things grow. And I think we have to do a couple things. One is, I think we have to teach these things. You know, a lot of students find these dry subjects. I think we have to link them to real life contexts. So they don't see it as an abstraction, but something that they're actually contributing to something that actually will increase the quality of life of others. I think we have to, obviously, and we're doing this, but we have to do it more, get students equipped to deal with more advanced technologies that will become much more critical, particularly as they become more attuned to more of the skills that they need to have. And I think we have to develop an understanding that we have to link these to economic strategies that are understandable to policymakers, because I don't know how many policymakers, they may have a cursory understanding of these issues, but not as essential of an understanding of these issues and why it's so important in economic development.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Curt. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you very much.
And that'll do it for today.